Have you ever had one of those moments where you stop and think, haven't I been here before? Not in the sense that you've literally lived this moment before, but I mean emotionally. You find yourself facing a familiar challenge, a familiar frustration, a familiar fear. Maybe it's a difficult decision you've been avoiding. Maybe it's another opportunity that slipped away because you doubted yourself. Maybe it's the same habit you promised you would finally break. Or maybe it's simply the feeling that no matter how much your life changes on the outside, certain struggles keep finding their way back to you. It's almost as if life keeps handing you different versions of the same exam. There's different people, different places, different circumstances, yet somehow the lesson feels strangely familiar. And when that happens, most of us ask the same question, which is, why does this keep happening to me? I know I've asked that question, and maybe you have too. For a long time, I believe life was simply a series of random events, some good, some painful, some fortunate, some unfair. But over time, after studying esoteric teachings, philosophy, psychology, recovery, and human behavior, I began to notice something, that the events weren't always repeating, but my responses were. And that realization changed everything. Because if our responses keep repeating, then perhaps our results eventually do too. Today, I want to explore why so many of us seem to live through the same lessons again and again. And more importantly, how we can finally begin to break that cycle. Because I don't believe that life is interested in keeping you trapped. I believe it's inviting you. It's inviting you to become someone new. Now, I realize that's a bold statement, because if you're going through a difficult season right now, it probably doesn't feel like an invitation. It feels exhausting. It feels frustrating. Sometimes it even feels unfair. When we're in the middle of a painful experience, our first instinct is usually to ask, how do I get out of this? And that's understandable. Pain naturally makes us look for the nearest exit. But I've learned that sometimes the better question isn't, how do I escape this? It's, what am I supposed to understand before I move beyond this? Now, there's an important difference. One question is focused on relief, and the other is focused on growth. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that every painful experience was somehow meant to happen. I know that life contains accidents, injustice exists, people make harmful choices, terrible things happen to good people. I'm not interested in pretending otherwise, but I am interested in something else. I'm interested in what happens after the experience. Because while we can't always control what happens to us, we have far more influence over what happens within us than we realize. And I think that's where many of life's repeating cycles begin. Not in the event itself, but in the meaning that we attach to it. Try to think back to when you were a child. Every experience was teaching you something. Some lessons were wonderful. You've learned what you love. You learned what that felt like. You've also learned trust. You learned curiosity. But you also learned fear. You learned disappointment. You've learned what rejection felt like. You've learned how people responded when you made mistakes. Without even realizing it, your mind began collecting evidence about how the world works. And it was trying to answer questions like, am I safe? Can people be trusted? Do I have value? What happens if I fail? All of those conclusions became part of the framework through which you viewed future experiences. The fascinating thing is that most of us never stop to examine whether those conclusions are actually true, though. We simply continue living from them. Just imagine someone who spends years believing they're just not disciplined. Maybe they tried to exercise a few times and quit. Maybe they started a business idea but never finished it. Maybe they promised themselves they would wake up earlier, eat healthier, save more money, or finally write that book they've always talked about. After enough unfinished attempts, they stop seeing those moments as isolated experiences. They begin turning them into an identity. Instead of saying, I struggle with consistency, they begin saying things like, I'm just an inconsistent person. Now, do you hear the difference? One describes behavior and the other defines a person. And that's a dangerous shift, because behaviors can change. Identities, however, are much harder, and that's a challenge. Once we begin believing something about ourselves, we unconsciously start looking for evidence to support that. We notice every mistake, every setback, every unfinished goal. Meanwhile, we overlook all the moments that contradict the story we've been telling ourselves. The lesson isn't repeating because life has decided we're incapable. The lesson repeats because we've unknowingly started acting as though our old conclusions are permanent. And if we're not careful, we can spend years living inside of a story that was never actually true. One of the questions people ask me is, if these patterns are so deeply rooted, how do we actually change them? I think many of us make the mistake of believing that transformation begins changing our circumstances. But I don't think that's always the case. Where it starts, I think transformation begins with the awareness. And you cannot change a pattern you don't recognize. Think about that. Think about that for a moment. How many times have you reacted to something before you even realize you were reacting? Someone says something that irritates you. Someone doesn't return your phone call. What's another example? Someone disagrees with you, and within seconds, your emotions have already taken over. The reaction feels automatic, almost as if someone else is driving. But here's the interesting part. The moment you become aware of that reaction, you've already interrupted the pattern. Awareness creates space. And inside that space, you get to choose. That's where your freedom begins. Not because life suddenly became easier, but because you stopped living on autopilot. The second thing I encourage you to do is become curious about your own life. Curiosity is one of the most overlooked tools for personal growth. Instead of criticizing yourself every time something goes wrong, become an investigator and ask yourself, what keeps showing up? What emotion do I keep avoiding? What situation always seems to trigger me? What story am I telling myself that might not actually be true? Notice I didn't say to judge yourself. I said to study yourself, and there's a huge difference. Because judgment usually shuts down learning, but curiosity opens the door to it. The third thing is something I wish I had understood years ago, and that is separate who you are from what you've done. Because you've made mistakes, so have I. Everyone has. But your mistakes are experiences. They are not your identity. You may have failed. That doesn't make you a failure. You may have been rejected, and that doesn't mean you're unworthy. Also, you may have doubted yourself, which doesn't mean you'll never become confident. Too many people confuse temporary experiences with permanent definitions. And then they spend years living beneath their potential because of a sentence they started believing about themselves years ago. Oh, and here's another practice that changed my own life. Whenever I find myself facing a familiar challenge, I pause and I ask one simple question. What would the person I'm becoming do next? Not the person I used to be, not the person driven by fear, not the version of me that's trying to please everybody, the person I'm working to become. Because that question changes everything. It shifts your attention away from your history and toward your direction. Your past may explain you, but it doesn't necessarily define you. And finally, if you can give yourself permission to grow gradually. I mean, we live in a culture that celebrates overnight success, instant results, quick fixes, 30-day transformation, but real change really works that way. I mean, it can, but also real change is often so quiet that you don't even notice it's happening. It's choosing patience instead of anger. It's setting one healthy boundary. It's keeping one promise you made to yourself. It's responding differently in one familiar situation. Those moments don't usually make headlines, but they change lives. Eventually, those small decisions become habits, and those habits become character, and that character quietly creates a different future. Maybe that's why life seems to repeat certain lessons. Not because it's trying to defeat us, but because every lesson gives us another opportunity to respond differently. Another opportunity to become wiser. Another opportunity to become more aware. And another opportunity to become more of ourselves. So the next time you find yourself asking, why does this keep happening to me? Try asking a different question. What is this experience asking me to become? And I think you'll be surprised by how often the answer isn't found in changing your circumstances. It's found in changing your awareness. Because once your awareness changes, your choices begin to change. And when your choices begin to change, your habits begin to change. And of course, when your habits begin to change, your life begins to change. And not all at once, but one decision at a time. One lesson at a time and one day at a time. And maybe that's what transformation has always been. Not becoming someone else, but becoming more conscious of who you've always had the potential to become all along. Hey, if today's conversation gave you something to think about, I'd love for you to continue this journey with me. So be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And for more conversations and practical and meaningful transformation, feel free to head over to natashanile.com. And thank you for tuning in.